Vlad, if you, hold on just one second. Let me see the page. Here. Go here. Pull one of these in.
Okay. So we can put here just YouTube.
What you do. You can, you just use the video code. All right. Okay, so just want to check in at the back. If you guys are good on the tech side and there's not going to be any whispering or talking, let me know. If not, let me know how much time you need, but I want to get started. So, Alex, we good? All right. Okay, so welcome. Alex. Guys in the back.
I didn't get that.
Hey, if you guys are good, let me know. And if you are good, let's stop. Just want to make sure that we're good and you guys don't need to. Okay. All right. Welcome to War and Storytelling in Ukraine. And the title of this lecture, this is an open lecture of a course that I'm going to be teaching at Kiev-Mohylanska Department of Journalism to the graduate students. But I'm going to make it an open course to anyone in the university, and actually anyone in Kiev, Ukraine, or around the world that cares about the war in Ukraine and the history that's being written here. And this lecture is about three things. It's about war, it's about storytelling, and it's going to be about the future of Ukraine's history. And those are the three things that we're going to talk about in this discussion, or this lecture. Those are the three things that I'm going to explore. First of all, I want to talk about, and I want to talk to you about and impose my idea, and I say impose because I'm going to be very dogmatic about this, that the greatest weapon of mass destruction in war is not the nuclear bomb, which everyone's talking about right now because of the potential, but the greatest weapon in history of war, greatest weapon in human history ever invented, is actually story, and the power of storytelling to mobilize people to fight and die for a cause, all right? To mobilize people to fight and die on a battlefield or in a war for a country, for an idea. And I want to go through and share with you some stories about why that is the case. And I'm going to share that with you from my perspective, both as a former history teacher at the United States Military Academy at West Point, but also as a former Army officer who served in combat 2 times in Iraq as an officer. And finally, why that's so important on 9 principles of war that I want to introduce. And these are 9 principles of war that I've come up with that, for me, explain how you can understand the intersection of storytelling and its power in warfare. Because as an Army officer, I always felt that the Army didn't train enough for the power of storytelling. We were always very focused on the mechanics of how to use our weapon systems and how to be really good at what we were trained to do, which is fine, that was our job. But one of the things that I think that war theorists, from politicians all the way down to generals to regular soldiers on the ground, don't quite fully appreciate, and I hope that some of my former colleagues in the United States Army or officers from all over the world will watch this series and understand some of these principles and be able to apply it to their application, training for, and hopefully never having to use these skills in warfare. But if they do, this is very powerful. And then finally, after going through the 9 principles of war, I want to talk about so what? What do we do with this war that we're all experiencing in Ukraine, outside of Ukraine, whether you're Ukrainian or not? If you're watching this series, you're part of this story, whether you know it or not. And that's something I want to share with everyone who's following this and cares about this story, is how everyone's a part of this in their own way. And the future of Ukraine's history. Because the big idea I want everyone to get from this, and this is the reason why I'm teaching this course, this is the reason why I founded a nonprofit based on the war in Ukraine, supporting the story around this war, is that more important than the war itself, the story that's told from this war is going to have a much greater impact. It's going to ripple throughout history far more than actually what's happened. The stories that the people who were in this war in any capacity, whether you're living through it as a student, you're volunteering as a civilian, you're on the front lines as a soldier, you're watching outside of the country as a displaced person or refugee, or you're just a concerned citizen of the world, the story about what happened here is going to have a far bigger impact, not just on Ukrainian history, but world history, because of how we tell that. And understanding that principle now and how important that is now will affect the quality of the truth of the power of that story for not just our generation, but generations to come. And that's really what I want everyone to understand. Watching this talk is how important the history and the story will be in the future compared to actually what's happened. Okay, we're all going to die. Maybe not in this war, but we're all going to die and pass on one of these days. And what we've experienced and seen will only live through the story that we tell. And what we've experienced and felt and seen will only live through the story that future generations understand from this war. And we have a unique opportunity compared to ancient historians who just were able to leave scraps of paper. We can leave so much more for future generations. We can use video, we can leave videos, we can leave so many different things because of the power of modern media, multimedia, which should be very interesting to all of you as journalism students, and the power that we have to shape the narrative and shape history through the story that we tell around this war is really the important thing that I want us all to leave, not just this talk with, but all the talks that I give throughout this course and beyond in the Borderlands Foundation that we've created. I want to make sure we do. So there's an old saying that history is written by the victors. And I would like to share with you a story that I think updates that saying, which is history is written by the victors before it's ever written. And the principle behind this story this is a man named Colonel H.R. McMaster at the time. You can see him, this is in 2006 in Fort Carson, Colorado. And this was all the officers got together after our deployment to Iraq. And the purpose of this session that we were in was, it was called an after-action review. And this is where he brought all the officers together and he said, what are the lessons that we've learned from 1 year that we just spent in combat in Iraq? And the reason why this was so important was Colonel McMaster was a history teacher. He was a legendary history teacher in the United States Army. He wrote a book, a best-selling book on the lies that led to the Vietnam War and why we lost the Vietnam War as an American country, not just as a military, but as a country. While he was an active officer, he wrote a book about the lies that led to Vietnam. It was called Dereliction of Duty. Lyndon Johnson, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the lies that led to the Vietnam War. And he was basically criticizing everyone in the military establishment, all the way up to the president and civilian decision makers, about how they got that war wrong. And that's not a very smart thing to do as an officer, because even after these generals retire, they always stay around. They're called graybeards. They hang around in Washington, D.C. They get on television. They write books. They mentor the current crop of general officers. So he was kind of not afraid to kick over the establishment and talk truth to power. But General McMaster, at the time, Colonel McMaster, was the regimental commander in the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, which was the unit I was in that deployed to Iraq. And at that time in 2005 and 6, we were actually, I hate to say this because it's an imperfect analogy, but we were a lot like, not the Ukrainian army, but we were a lot like the Russian army in the current conflict, because we'd invaded a country and we were having a really hard time holding on to and securing that country after. Now there's so many things that are different. We didn't want to stay there. We've basically left, handed back the country to the Iraqi people, but the war was not going well. Okay, we were having a really hard time holding on to control of the country, and what had been a 3-week campaign that was very successful, very quick in terms of toppling the regime. Saddam Hussein was not a popular person in his own country. People really weren't willing to fight and die for his regime. But that was the easy part. The invasion turned out to be much easier than securing the peace afterwards. And Colonel McMaster was the regimental commander, and I was a young captain at the time, and I had the privilege, or the curse, depending on how you look at it, of being his adjutant. So I had to basically follow him around and schedule his helicopter flights all around the battlefield, get with him in his armored patrols through the city of Tal Afar, combat patrols that he went on as a colonel, go to all of his meetings, take notes, make sure he was on time, which he never was. That I didn't help the matter any, because I don't really like to be on time myself, but my job was to make him on time. And I had this kind of catbird seat to history, where I got to see a legendary commander who had already won a Silver Star in the Gulf War by destroying a regiment's worth of Iraqi army, Republican Guard. I think it was a couple thousand soldiers, his unit of 120 people defeated with no casualties in a 25-minute battle. And he was already a legendary commander. And what he did in Iraq was he took the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, which had almost 5,000 soldiers and about 25,000 Iraqi soldiers, police in northwestern Iraq, and he took one of the hardest areas that was having a huge insurgency, and he managed to launch a huge offensive, pacify that area, and really create the first successful counterinsurgency campaign that worked and lasted in the campaign to secure Iraq.
Where was that again?
In Tal Afar, in 2005 and 6. And General McMaster had, at the time, Colonel McMaster, he had become a legendary commander just by the fact of what he'd done. And as the adjutant, what I had this really amazing perception watching him as a historian, as a person, was he would sit in meeting after meeting with the Iraqi army, with the local sheikhs, with the police, and the war was not going well, but he started to say, this is what's going to happen. Okay, he tuned into the Iraqi population's discontent, and instead of saying, hey, we've done everything perfectly, you guys should be loving us because we freed you from Saddam Hussein, he listened, and he listened to the population, and he said, you know what, I hear you. The American army made a lot of mistakes when we came into Iraq. Okay, we didn't secure the critical infrastructure. We fired the Iraqi army. We embarrassed, humiliated a lot of people who were part of the security services. We did not do this right. Okay, and he was really the first American officer at a very high level to sit down, listen to the population, level with them, and tell them, I hear you, and I'm going to apologize on behalf of my government for the mistakes that we've made, but here's the deal. Right now, we're having a huge amount of insurgency. The Islamic State, which was radical Islamist, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and the Islamic State was just getting started at that point. They were creating suicide car bombs. Marketplaces were no longer safe to go shopping in. Families were afraid to send their children to school, afraid to go out because they didn't want to be caught in a violent crossfire between the insurgents and the American soldiers and the new Iraqi army and police, which were targets. And what he realized as a commander, who was a great warfighter, who loved to fight, who loved to, shoot big weapons and conduct massive campaigns of, armored violence, because that's what he'd been trained to do. But he was able to understand that the center of gravity in this war, and in all wars, is not what army wins, but is what army inspires the people that they're fighting on that land to support them. And he understood that as much as he wanted to go out and solve a lot of problems by fighting and killing our enemy, that we couldn't kill everyone that was against us. We had to inspire the Iraqi population to get onto our side and secure their own country, which he said, hey, you need to step up and help your own government secure your own country, and then we'll leave. But we want to leave you better off than we found you. Right now the situation's worse, and we need your help to take control of your own country, then we're going to leave this country. And he relentlessly refined and gave that message, and much more than even the violent events that happened, and there were plenty of them. Navy SEALs were in the town, snipers running all over the place, Rangers coming in, helicopter gunships. Lots of fighting was happening. But the most important thing that I saw was he was able to tell the population, this is the story that's going to happen. Okay? We've made mistakes. This is the story that's happened. Let's be honest about it. But this is what's going to happen. You're going to step up, you're going to secure your country, and we're going to leave. And only when you've done that will you get your country back. And Iraq, fast forward to 2020, they've had a lot of ups and downs, but my interpreter, who used to live there and now lives in the United States but travels back regularly, he said, things are going really well economically, and we've basically, it's a messy democracy, but we feel better than we've ever felt. That's 2022. That took 20 years after the invasion, right? But what that taught me watching this was great leaders, and this happens in politics. You guys know this with President Zelensky, servant of the people. He makes a TV show about becoming president, and then he becomes president based on the TV show. Great leaders tell a story before it ever happens, and they make it so. And that one principle of storytelling being someone who can tap into the story that everyone's feeling right now and then tell the future as it needs to be is the most powerful weapon in human history ever created. Okay, and you can apply that weapon with your children. You can apply that weapon with your, and I say weapon, not with your children in that way, but this powerful tool of storytelling can work on any relationship, all the way up to wars between societies, is understanding and really connecting with where people are and how they feel, and then helping them tell the story of a better future. That's what politicians do to get elected. That's what leaders do to win wars. And that's really the foundation of the power of war and the power of storytelling in war that I think covers everything that happens in war, starts with that principle. So war is a battle of stories. And my favorite historical figure growing up, I was born in Belfast, Northern Ireland. My father is English, and I grew up to stories of World War II history. Okay, and I grew up to stories of the Battle of Britain, and I read the 6-volume history that Churchill wrote of World War II, and recently just finished William Manchester's biography on him. And think about Winston Churchill in 1940 after France fell to Germany. Americans aren't coming into the war. France, their biggest ally, has just fallen. Germany basically controls the continent. They've just conquered Norway. Hitler and Stalin are best friends. In fact, Stalin's shipping just tons of oil and food from Ukraine and oil from the Caucasus that's fueling the German war machine. And Winston Churchill, literally the only weapon he had was his ability to write speeches and get on radio, and basically convince the British, not just the British people, but the Americans who were supporting the British, that all hope was not lost. And the power of his ability until the Soviet Union was invaded, Ukraine, and we'll get to that in a moment, the Soviet Union was invaded and Britain was basically fighting alone for 1 year. That's all that he had really at his disposal, while the entire British Army had just evacuated from France at Dunkirk, left all of their equipment. Things were looking pretty bleak. And Winston Churchill, as famously said, John F. Kennedy, I think, paraphrased what one of the commenters, media commenters said at the time was, he mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. Okay? And war is a battle of stories. And Winston Churchill had this amazing ability for all of the Allies, because it brought the Americans into the war, even managed to create an alliance, a very interesting alliance with the Soviet Union, the Americans and the British, was fighting what I think we can all look back on and agree was not the best outcome for humanity if Hitler would have won the Second World War. Now, it was an imperfect victory, because a lot of you who lived under Soviet domination in Central and Eastern Europe after the war, that wasn't a great result either for a lot of people. But eventually the Cold War ended, and the Warsaw Bloc fell, and Ukraine and a lot of ex-Soviet republics now have gained their independence. But we're still living through the after effects of that even to this day, as we all see through the war. Now this picture I brought up for a very specific reason. This was filmed in Zaporizhia on 10 March 1943. It was Hitler's, one of his last visits to the front lines. He was just, I think, 40 kilometers away from the front lines in Ukraine at the time. He was visiting General Erich von Manstein, who was the German commander of the forces in Ukraine. And Erich von Manstein is a very interesting figure, because as a U.S. Army officer, I remember studying him as a cadet, because we actually took a trip to France in 1940 with our professors for 10 days to study the German invasion of France in 1940. And the American Army, when I was growing up in it, had this extreme fascination and almost hero worship of the proficiency of the German Army in World War II. Because the German Army in World War II was pretty amazing at fighting, okay? And there's no way to deny some of their battlefield exploits, especially in the early parts of the war, were amazing military history achievements that deserve to be studied. But I remember as a professor, when I went to go back and teach at West Point, Adam Tooze, this famous economic historian, military historian, came to talk to the faculty at West Point, and he confronted us. It was very interesting. He said, you know, this fascination and this worship of German military tactics, do you know where this comes from? Well, during the Cold War, when the Soviet Army was in East Germany, and we were deathly afraid, especially after Vietnam when we lost, that the Soviet tanks were going to roll through Germany and go to France and basically take over Western Europe. The American Army, after the Vietnam War, had just lost this war. They went to the German they sat down with General Manstein, who's a very old man at this point, and they said, teach us, please, how to beat the Soviets, right? You wrote the book. And I mean, you had this amazing series of victories. He wrote a book called Lost Victories about his amazing series of victories against the Soviet army in Ukraine, both going through Ukraine on the offensive and fighting against tremendous odds the Soviet army that was sweeping back through Ukraine in 1943. The battles down at the Azov. You guys think the Battle of Mariupol is the first time that's happened? No. Okay, during the Battle of Azov, the battles of Crimea, during the Second World War, the exact same battles happened. Okay, even the Battle of Izum in Kharkiv, the same operational plan the Ukrainian army just executed that was executed in 1942, which surrounded an entire 4 Soviet armies in the Izum area. Okay, history especially in Ukraine, there's a huge shadow looming over Ukraine. And we're going to talk about World War II and what that means to Ukraine and to the world. Because if you think about the storytelling around this war, what is it all going back to? We're fighting Nazis, okay? That's what Putin, that's how he's mobilizing the Russian population. We're just going to kill Nazis. It's the same thing. They're manned by the American army, which, is just a descendant of the Nazis, according to Putin. Okay, and there's some truth to that. American tactics, which are very maneuver-oriented, they got all of that from learning from the German generals in the 1970s and 80s, and that was bred into the officer corps, and that was taught. We would visit the battlefields of France and follow the great campaigns of the German army in 1940. France fell in 6 weeks, when in 4 years in World War I, they didn't conquer France. So there's some truth to some of these stories that are out there, right? Which is the Western military establishment became enamored of and fascinated by the German army. But here's the one thing that Tooze said in this meeting that I'll never forget, is he said, I remember we were talking about the Fulda Gap and how the Soviets were going to come in, and we were talking about this idea of deep battle and letting the enemy come in so you can surround them. And then we all looked around, and some of the American officers said, well, we're going to let the Soviet army get all the way to Luxembourg and down into southern France. There's 80 million people. What's going to happen to them? And Manstein and all these officers just said, well, that's war. So the German army, which was so good at fighting, they didn't care about what happened to the civilian population. And in Ukraine, you know that. You know that better than anyone from the history, was people in World War II, in the way of the German, these titanic clashes that had great maneuver warfare, people didn't matter. Right? And one of the main reasons, and I'm going to talk to you about this through this talk, why did the German army lose when they were man for man the best army of World War II? And they outfought consistently. They inflicted way more casualties on the Americans than the Americans have inflicted on them, and we'll talk about what they did with the Red Army in the beginning of the campaign. But ultimately they lost. Now, there's this joke that the victors write history, and I say, well, the History Channel didn't get the memo because Nazis keep the History Channel in business, right? Nazis and American Confederate Army is like, that's what the American History Channel is built on. But the reason Hitler lost, and I'm going to argue through this talk, is because he got the story wrong. And that is something that you need to understand. So who am I and why am I up here talking about storytelling? That's me right before I left the Army in 2013. My last 5 years teaching, my last 5 years in the Army, I spent as a professor of Russian history at West Point, the United States Military Academy at West Point. The last 3 years I taught freshmen who were 18, 19 years old, new cadets or freshman cadets in their first year, European history the first semester, and then Russian history the second semester. And 2 years before that, I spent studying Russian history at NYU under the greatest Russian scholars in the American academic system, Richard Wortman, Jane Burbank, Yanni Katsonis, all these great intellectuals who've studied Russian history. And at that point in 2008 to 10, when I went to grad school, studying Russian history wasn't very cool because everyone was studying Arabic, war on terror, Islamic history, getting ready for the fight with China. Everyone just forgot about Russia. They said, oh, the Cold War's over, right? But Vladimir Putin didn't seem to get the memo. I left the Army in 2013, and I did a very interesting career move where it didn't make a lot of sense to anyone at the time, including myself, but I didn't want to stay in the Army, and I went into digital marketing. I became a media agency owner, traveled the world for a year. Actually, during the time I was traveling the world, the Maidan revolution started. I remember sitting in a cafe in Stockholm, Sweden, watching the first protests happen and following that very incessantly, because when I was teaching Russian history at West Point, my specialty was Ukrainian history. In fact, my thesis was on Catherine the Great and her conquest of southern Ukraine and Crimea, and my wife's now named Katerina. So perfect symmetry there. And I was studying Ukrainian history as my main focus, and I was fascinated by, and I'd met a bunch of Ukrainians while I was living in New York City, and met some people even from Crimea, and I was fascinated by and had friends from Ukraine and what was happening at that time. People from Belarus, people from Russia, Ukraine. I was friends with all of them, and when this started all in 2014, I was following it very closely. Then I ended up moving to Poland. I started teaching a course on storytelling. I think we've sold 15 or 20,000 copies of this course online that we've called Story Matters, Storytelling in the Digital Age, and became a kind of a storytelling expert. And I was teaching business owners how to use storytelling to grow their business. And that's what I've been doing for the last 10 plus years since I left, or 8 or 9 years since I left the United States Army, is running a media company, building technology, and teaching storytelling. So I've found a way with this course to start combining storytelling and war. And one of the things, I'm going to get to this later, there's basically, so now let's move into the 9 principles of war. And when I talk about the 9 principles of war, I want to do a couple things. I want to explore the historical analogies, because the history of World War II is still impacting this war. The narrative of World War II is rich in the mobilization, the stories of this war, the lessons, the tactical plans that people are still using, or they're basically rerunning battles from World War II. But more importantly, war, the greatest teacher is history, and it's not that history repeats itself, it rhymes, it always comes up in different ways, but a lot of the trends are just embedded in the geography, the culture, the narratives that stay with us throughout history. And I'm going to talk about the first 3 levels of war, and I call this actually information. The storytelling part of war, which most military historians go straight into. They go straight into, offensive operations, raids. They go into the kinetic part of warfare, the fighting. But really, the most important part actually starts with the storytelling. And that's the first principle, and that's why it's number 1, which is if you get storytelling right, everything else is just a matter of time, in my perspective. Now, stories can rise and fall. So someone can have a more powerful story at the beginning of a war and lose because their story deteriorates, it gets worse. But ultimately, if you get the story right, you're going to win the war. It's just a question of time. It's just a question of how painful, what the cost is going to be. And I illustrate this point by putting up there the 2 grand protagonists of the Second World War from Ukraine's perspective, which is Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler. And Stalin was not a popular guy in Ukraine. I don't have to, I think, tell any of you that something you don't know. In 1939, when Hitler and Stalin made their alliance of convenience to carve up what was left of Poland at the time and basically wipe Poland off the map, Ukraine had just finished if you've read Timothy Snyder's famous book called Bloodlands, you can get very deep, rich history about this, but Stalin killed anywhere between 3 and 5 million Ukrainians in the Holodomor, the Great Famine of 1932 and 1933. He targeted specifically the intelligentsia of Ukraine and a bunch of different ethnic minorities that lived in Ukraine: Poles, Ukrainians, Germans, any perceived enemies of the state, Tartars. They were all rounded up and executed. A couple million people were killed in Ukraine by Stalin during the 1930s. So Stalin was not a popular figure in Ukraine, and when Hitler invaded in 1941, everyone likes to look back in history and say, of course it was never going to work. Okay, of course Operation Barbarossa was doomed to failure. But from the German perspective, that's not true, because in 1918, the German army controlled Ukraine completely at the end of World War I. Ukraine was given by the Bolsheviks in a peace treaty to Germany, as well as Belarusia and the Baltic states. So from the German perspective, we've beaten Russia before, okay? We're just going to go back and do what we did in 1918, but this time we just wiped France off the face of the battlefield, the map, basically. We don't have a two-front war like we did in 1918. France is completely subjugated. This guy's making speeches on the radio, who cares? Okay? We should be able to make short work of Russia, of the Soviet Union, and look at Stalin. This guy, he's not really popular, is he? I mean, do you really think the Ukrainians are going to stand up and fight for this guy? Do you think the Belarusians are going to stand up and fight for this guy? That actually was a very, very lucrative opportunity for Hitler, was if he just would have come into Ukraine and said, hey, I'm like the Americans tried to say in Iraq, and the Iraqis really didn't fight that hard for Saddam. We're just liberating you from this evil dictator, and acted accordingly, not just said it, but acted accordingly. History could have turned out very differently. But that's not the way the German army behaved when they came into Ukraine, and we all know that. And we'll talk about the history of the German army's treatment of Ukraine. And fundamentally, Hitler couldn't do that because his story, on which he got elected, which made him so powerful inside of Germany, didn't allow him to treat Ukrainians. Ukrainians were Slavic, Untermenschen. Ukraine was all about living space. There was a whole plan which was developed in detail by the general staff to not just kill all of the Jews, but to depopulate Ukraine and resettle it with German farmers and army officers who'd served their time in the Wehrmacht, because Germany needed living room. So Hitler's story didn't allow him to do the thing that if he would have done it, if he would have come in and just behaved a little bit better than Stalin, the war could have turned out very differently. And that story is what cost Germany the war. We're going to talk about, when I introduce each one of the sets of principles, I introduce them in threes. I'm going to go back to history just to remind you about the historical precedents and examples of the things that we're talking about as we explore the current war. So there's three principles. Storytelling first, and then I'm going to go in as a marketing agency owner. I'm going to bring marketing and business terms into military warfare theory, because I want to explain to you why these are the most important things. And story, or information at its heart, the reason these three principles are so important is information is what wins or loses the local population. All right? And any military that fails to win over a local population is destined to lose. And I think everyone understood before the war, and we'll talk about this a little bit more at the end of this, everyone understood at the beginning of this war that Russia was doomed to failure in Ukraine long term, but no one imagined the war would turn out the way it's turning out right now, because of different expectations and assumptions about what was going to happen. But ultimately, the reason Stalin won, with a lot of help from other allies, is he just had a little bit better or less evil story than Hitler. Okay, and it's not that hard to outdo Stalin on storytelling, but Hitler managed to really mess it up, right, for the Ukrainians and for the Belarusians. So let's look at President Zelensky and President Putin. That picture of President Zelensky at the podium, as you know, he no longer wears suits. It's all green, tan, camouflage, and that in itself tells a huge story. And then President Putin, this is the day he announced that he was going to invade Ukraine, or a special military operation, as he called it. And both of them have very different stories about why they're going to war. And both of them are getting a fair amount of success with their population with that story, okay? But the difference between Russians being willing to die for their story versus maybe support it by watching on television is very different than Ukrainians. And we all know, as the war has progressed, Ukraine doesn't have a problem with getting people to volunteer for the military. They don't have a problem with people trying to dodge conscription efforts. And Russia, more people have left Russia since mobilization was announced than invaded Ukraine. So they've actually lost more people than they've probably lost on the battlefield to just fleeing the country. And the story of President Putin, first of all, you have to treat it with respect as someone who obviously doesn't believe in it, and understand, where does this come from and how can he still be in power, which I think is quite an achievement, with the way the war's been going so badly. And it's because he has a story that's not working that well on the battlefield, but it's working well enough to keep him in power and keep him in the war. And if Ukrainians do not respect and understand and have a little bit of empathy for that story and where it's coming from, you run the risk of doing what President Putin did, which was completely underestimating and losing to your enemy because you get the story wrong. Just because Ukraine's winning the storytelling narrative right now doesn't mean that can't change. And you can bet that President Putin is trying to do everything that he can to change the narrative of the story. The only time the Russian military has ever really won is when a leader manages to convince their people that they are truly under an existential threat. And this isn't just some military adventure, for the glory of the leader. That changes everything in Russia. And Putin is trying as hard as he can, if you watch state media, to paint this as a war against the West and as an invasion of the Nazis, and the Americans are just, inheritors of the Nazi tradition. I mean, their military has studied all of their stuff, and they use the same tactics and the same terminology, and they have the same ideology, right? They're fascists. And Ukrainians are just puppets of Nazis from the West who just infest the West. And if we don't understand that and have empathy for that and understand that that's what we're up against as a story, and fight against that constantly in Ukraine and across the West, we could fall victim to what happened to President Putin, which is he completely dismissed out of hand the story that Ukraine has. And Ukraine's story is, we're a free people. We've always been free. That's our freedom, is our religion. And we are willing to fight and die for our freedom. And that's a very simple but powerful story that President Putin just refused to believe. And if you read his essay on the Kremlin's website from June of 2022, he talks about on the historical unity of Russian and Ukrainian people. He wasn't just writing that for his health. Like Hitler wasn't just writing Mein Kampf, to become a best-selling author. That's what he believed. And if you've listened to President Putin's speeches over the last several years, he said to President Bush in 2007 at the NATO summit, Ukraine isn't a real state. His ideas and his story that he's telling himself and has told his country about Ukraine are not new. But they're the reason why Russia at this point is losing the war. But we should be very careful to dismiss the reason why Russia is still able to stay in the war. And how that story that they're trying to bring up and they're trying to spin up, and the greatest gift that President Putin could ever get would be, from his perspective, and a lot of people in his corner think, that if we could just get the West to come in and threaten us and really become involved in this war, or our people feel like they're really involved in this war, then that changes everything, right? We're going to fight to the death. We know how to do that. We did it in 1941, 40 to 45. We did that in the War of 1812. If we can just get that back, then we can win this, right? So this battle of stories between these two presidents, and it's fascinating. They both have the same name, after the founder of Christendom in Ukraine, Volodymyr or Vladimir. It's a fascinating historical irony of this one name and two different pronunciations of the same name and different heritages and very different stories about what Ukraine and Kiev and Ukraine's rich history, which is older than Russia's and Moscow's, means, and who owns it, right? Who gets to actually use that history for their own national narrative. So in the storytelling class, we're going to really dive deep into, and I'm going to ask all of you to consider both sides, because if you don't study both sides and you just congratulate yourself on how well you're doing on your own side in Ukraine, you run the very real risk of making the same mistakes that Russia's done. So we're going to go into both sides in the story. The second principle I'd like to emphasize is right below storytelling is marketing. And marketing is basically using mass media to get the message out there, using social media, using television appearances, using newspapers, influencing the media. And what's amazing about this war is nobody thought, I think, President Zelensky was the best potential wartime leader that Ukraine ever could have elected. And I don't think he's done everything perfectly at all. There's a lot of things that President Zelensky could do better, and if he's honest and he's a good politician, he understands that, and he's working on those things. But I think one of the things that we all need to recognize is that comedian's actually kind of a funny profession, because you kind of think it's a joke of a profession, but actually Joe Rogan, who runs one of the most popular podcasts in the world, actually I think the most popular podcast in the world, he's a comedian, and he talks about how hard it is to be a successful stand-up comedian and how few really good stand-up comedians there are in the world, because it's so hard to get it right. And if you look at President Zelensky and all of his background in entertainment, the ultimate form of communication and storytelling is actually humor, because it's the hardest thing to get right and pull off. And that's why being a comedian is so hard, and also they get so much reward for it in terms of financial reward. And what President Zelensky has been able to do once the war started, and I'm going to go through this in our Principles of Storytelling lecture next week, is he's played the part perfectly of convincing the world that he's not provoking a war. Okay, there's no way that anyone could accuse him of wanting to have this war started. He was at the Munich conference right before the war started, begging Putin to sit down with him and negotiate, right? Which can upset some people in Ukraine who are like, we just need to fight this guy as if they're going to come fight. But he was begging Putin, let's sit down, let's talk. Even when the war started, hey, we're still ready to talk. We're having talks, we're ready to not join NATO. Now we've applied for NATO membership. But I remember watching the war, and I actually interviewed Sergei, I think one of the first days of the war, on our initial broadcast for Borderlands. And the moment where the first night of the war, I was speaking to Alex. I'd left Ukraine, I got a media company out of Ukraine, but I was speaking to Alex, who was still in Ukraine, who was running my tech company. This could be over pretty soon. And I remember the next day when President Zelensky posted this video, I shared it on my Facebook feed. He said, hey, we're all here, right? And it's pretty hard to fake a selfie video out there in the center of Kiev. Reznikov and his chief of staff and his minister, they're all standing there saying, hey, we're here. Actually, Minister of Foreign Affairs was flying back from the US at that point. And that was the basement for 23 hours, came out and did that. Whatever happened, it doesn't matter, because the perception across the world was, here's this poor, weak, not wanting to fight, peace candidate, Jewish comedian in Ukraine who's out there making selfie videos saying, hey, we're here and we're ready to fight. It was like this complete metamorphosis where no one could accuse the guy of trying to start the war, begging for it to not start, but then when it starts, let's go, all right? And that story, in my view, made all the difference in terms of people's willingness to go out and fight. And I always knew from talking to my Ukrainian friends that there was going to be a long insurgency. And actually, Sergei was saying on the second, third day of war, hey, we've been preparing for this for 8 years. We're ready to fight for the next 10, 15, 20 years. But I don't think anyone expected the military, and the Russian military outnumbered the Ukrainian military 12-1 outside of Kiev. But what they didn't expect was thousands of people just grabbing weapons that created among European leaders who've been holding back on sending helmets and medical supplies. Now all of a sudden Germany's sending tanks, and not tanks, but anti-aircraft, tracked anti-aircraft weapons, artillery, howitzer systems. It absolutely changed the dynamic of the war. The international support for Ukraine, I don't think any of us could have predicted the amount of weapons, the amount of support, the amount of financial support, the sanctions against Russia. Is it enough against Russia? Probably not. But President Biden is very sensitive to playing into the Russian story of the West versus Russia, and I think for good reason. There's reasons why America is being cautious in its support. Whether it's the right move or wrong move, there's a reason for it from a storytelling perspective. But President Zelensky, with his his flair for the camera. The guy's never met a camera I'm sure he doesn't like, right? An audience that he won't perform for. He's in the perfect role. And a lot of people have criticized President Zelensky. Why are you just doing speeches and videos and all that? Why aren't you? Your generals are doing fine. Like, stop messing with your generals. Keep talking, right? You're great at this stuff. Keep doing that marketing. And Ukraine is lucky to have someone who's so good at marketing and so good at storytelling on camera. I think that's been, every single day of the war, he's given a talk. Whether it's him sitting bleary-eyed at 3 a.m. in front of a phone selfie video, or he's doing high production quality, he's talking to the people every day. And you all see that. You all are getting those messages. And the story of the war, not just what's happening, but we're going to win. We're going to win. We're going to become part of Europe. We're going to become part of NATO. That's the story he's telling. And he's telling it before it's happening. And I think it's working. All right. Now, sales is different. In marketing for business and sales, marketing is what makes sales easier or even unnecessary. You create a bunch of marketing and ads, and then people come in and they end up buying. They end up getting on the phone with someone and making a purchasing decision, or they go to a shopping cart and they end up buying something. But in the military perspective, sales, in my view, is actually what soldiers do on the battlefield in relation to the population. Okay? And I remember in Iraq when we used to go into a house, I would tell my soldiers, I'd say, you need to remember that these Iraqis, we're going in to look for some people who may or may not be there, who are bad, but our intelligence isn't always perfect, and you need to understand that this family and those little kids, which in 5 years could be fighting you, this is their one and probably only interaction they're ever going to have with American soldiers. And you can absolutely shock them into a brand new perspective on who American soldiers really are versus the cartoon figures that they've been told. And when you look at pictures at the beginning of the war that made it out on Twitter of Ukrainians standing in front of Russian tanks, and Russians not shooting them, just like completely blown away, like, why aren't you welcoming us as liberators, right? That action, who are caught up in this huge thing that they don't want to be caught up in, and that interaction with humans, between the people and the soldiers on the battlefield, ultimately creates the outcome of the war. And how soldiers treat the civilian population, they either get them on the side or they don't. And there's different ways to get people on your side. One method is to kill a lot of people so that people are scared and they don't misbehave, right? That's one tactic. The other tactic is to really get people on your side by treating them well, with respect, and that's very hard because when there's 2% of the population trying to kill you and 90% are just trying to stay out of the way. You can make mistakes, and we did that in Iraq a lot of times. We would upset parts of the population by going after the really bad people, and they knew that their strength was to hide among it. And Sergey, who's with us here, who works with people who are out there in the population, the Ukrainian resistance movement behind the enemy lines right now is substantial because the Russians have not managed to win over the population, right? And the reason they've not managed to win over the population is because they've not been trained well in it, or they're not disciplined well. I mean, you're sending convicts into Ukraine. How do you think that's going to go? Do you think that's going to win hearts and minds by sending, serial mass murderers to lead platoons of other convicts in Ukraine? It's probably not going to go well. Okay, and it's going to push more and more people into the resistance movement, whether it's overt resistance or passive helping the resistance movement. That's the really critical part. And in this moment here, when this is actually a post from the Holocaust Foundation about the Babin Yar Memorial, which was bombed on March 1st. Okay, and on March 1st of 2022, this monument to where 60,000 people were killed, massacred in Ukraine during the Second World War, touched a nerve, and it caused a huge amount of outrage in the local population, international Jewish community, and that created, and it can get amplified on social media and have a huge effect. These negative interactions with the population, which especially get magnified. Look at what happened in Bucha. There's no possibility after Bucha and Izium that Ukrainian people now are going to accept anything less than complete victory or eviction of Russian forces from occupied territories, including Crimea, which at the beginning of the war, I think President Zelensky thought there was a potential for some kind of negotiation there, but now there's none. And that cycle of violence between people and the local army can be really difficult to overcome once you do that. And we experienced that in Iraq. Again, the American army was on the other side of this, and we had to navigate a lot of what the Russian military is experiencing in Ukraine. Now, the second three principles are what I call intelligence, and there's three parts to intelligence, and I'll go through those and I'll illustrate each one of those in the current war. But let's zoom back to World War II again. On 1942, June 22nd, 1941, Operation Barbarossa started. And Hitler moved 3 million German soldiers towards the borders of Ukraine and Belarusia and towards the Baltic states. And he managed to achieve a huge level of surprise against the Soviet Union because he literally chose to disregard all the intelligence he was getting from the Soviet. The NKVD was not stupid. They had all kinds of spies across Europe. They were warning Stalin about the movement of German forces. They were warning him. There was all kinds of surveillance along the border. But Stalin just chose, because of his story that he was telling himself, that Hitler wasn't going to invade him or violate their treaty. He basically just ignored it. And in fact, the first, I think, 16 or 17 days of the Operation Barbarossa, Stalin was in such shock that he didn't even get on the radio. He couldn't address his people for the first 2 weeks of the war because he was so shocked. He was so ashamed, or whatever his psychological condition was, over what had happened. It was a massive intelligence failure. And in the first part of the war, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get into the last three principles, the consequences of that intelligence failure were catastrophic, especially for Ukraine and the Red Army in general, in terms of 3 million in the very opening months of the war. It was absolutely catastrophic. And intelligence comes from support of the population. And one of the things that the Soviet Union managed to get right in the war after the initial shock of the invasion was the partisan movement. The partisan movement in Ukraine ended up destroying the German army's logistics. The farther they went into Russia, the Ukrainian resistance movement inside of Ukraine was based on great intelligence that the NKVD was able to create probably the biggest partisan insurgent movement in modern history. And what's amazing is, knowing that history, President Putin assumed that Ukraine was going to be easy, right? These guys were such good partisans in World War II. In fact, you guys didn't stop fighting until 1953. You didn't get the memo after the Red Army came in 1944. And the same story of national leaders choosing not to believe their own intelligence agencies played out in this war. President Zelensky famously, there was a, we'll talk about this in the intelligence, Major General Kirill Budanov here, the chief of the Ukrainian intelligence directorate. He was the one in the military intelligence side that was saying this war is going to happen, but I think President Zelensky wanted to listen to his friend who's now fired, who's running the SBU, and say, no, this isn't going to happen. And that was something he's got a lot to answer for to civil society. There's not a lot of people in the military and in Ukraine who are not happy that President Zelensky downplayed and didn't believe the intelligence that the Americans were saying before the war. Now, the Americans don't have a great history of intelligence failures ourselves. I mean, we got a lot wrong with Afghanistan and weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but President Zelensky didn't want to hear the intelligence that the Americans had said. But right before the war, the senior leaders of the Ukrainian government that heard General Budanov, and thankfully the military was listening to him, General Zaluzny and the officers took the war very seriously. Not all of them, some of them were more prepared than others, but overall, he was right about the Russian invasion. He talked about the date. He got it right. He got the date right, and he contradicted what was the political leadership in Ukraine was saying about the war. But let's look at Russia also. What did Russia get wrong in the lead up to the war? Well, Putin, if you looked at how the Russian forces came into Ukraine, they basically, I think one of the reasons why the SBU didn't understand the war was going to start or didn't want to believe it was because the Russian soldiers didn't know the war was going to start. They got lied to by their own leadership, and if Ukraine doing their job had spies all throughout the Russian military, they would have just heard what the soldiers were hearing. We're just on a training exercise in Belarus, drink it up, boys. Yeah, go sell your weapons, go sell your fuel, it doesn't matter. And then, whoa, we've got to go to war. And they're completely shocked by their own leadership. They were more surprised than the Ukrainians that the war was starting, the Russians. The Russian soldiers that were initially captured. And the reason why, according to American intelligence, and we'll read this, I'll give you some articles to talk about this when we get to it, is the Russian leadership that planned this war believed the story they'd been told by Putin and themselves, which was Ukraine's not a real country. It's hijacked and held hostage by a Nazi regime. The people want to be liberated. The people have read my 7,000-word essay on the unity of Russia and Ukraine, and they're waiting to be liberated by us, and it's going to be easy. So we're going to march to Kiev. We're going to call ahead with dinner reservations into Krishchatek restaurants, and we're just going to march down there, and we'll be there in 3 days. Now, Americans never believed that Ukrainians wouldn't fight. American intelligence, people I know, none of them said Kiev was going to fall in 3 days. What they said was, that's what Russia thinks. That's what Russia's plan is, which is they're going to be in Kiev in 3 days according to their plan. Okay, and they believe their own intelligence. They believe their own assumptions, which are based on the story. See, the story drives your assumptions that drive what you believe or choose to believe from your own intelligence agencies, all the way up and down. And we're going to talk about this from the strategic level all the way down to the tactical level of war. And in the next lesson, I'll talk about different levels of war and and how these principles go all the way down from, or up from the top president, political leadership, all the way down to the soldiers on the ground. Intelligence, human intelligence, is the most important type of intelligence. And thankfully, at least Ukraine's military intelligence had that right. And General Budmanov's been really interesting. He gave an interview back in May when Ukraine was getting absolutely, hammered in the Donbass with artillery. He said, don't worry, the war's going to turn. Mid-August, late August, Russian forces are just going to start breaking. He said by the end of the year, most of the major fighting will be done. Now, this is October 3rd, so we're not at the end of the year. But what's interesting is how dead on all of his predictions have been. He must have some great intelligence, and fundamentally, all great intelligence, satellites, all that kind of stuff we'll talk about. But fundamentally, it's the human intelligence, it's the spies, it's the understanding the motives of what's going on. That's the most important intelligence, and we'll talk about that and give examples of it. Now, surveillance is next. This is the Aero Rozhedka, which is an IT army since 2014. These guys, Ukraine IT professionals, have started a nonprofit that started integrating civilian technology into military operations. They've been doing it for 8 years, but restarted right when the war started. And this is nothing new in warfare. We've had observation balloons, we've had aircrafts, we've had helicopters. Aerial surveillance has always been there, but drones has really just accelerated the accessibility of surveillance to people all the way up and down. Drones are taking an outsized role because of the cost and the ease of employment on the battlefield. And before the war, you had light strategic intelligence, you had open source intelligence, which is a form of social media collective surveillance, all kinds of now without someone picking it up. Not just military people sitting back in Washington, D.C., but some goofball or not goofball like in a bad way, but just some hobbyist who just loves to look at satellite imagery for free and post their findings on Twitter, and that gets picked up and other people comment on it. And most of the war, the reason I knew the war was coming to Ukraine, and I was telling all my team members, who none of them believed me that was going to happen, was I was just watching all these open source intelligence analysts just say, here's the facts, here's the weapon systems that are on the ground, here's all these social media photos of tanks right by the Ukrainian border, and they're out there not parked in, they're not in tents, they're sleeping in the woods, which means, I know from experience, when you're sleeping in the woods, you can't do that for long, you need to start going. And that's when I knew, okay, this war is really about to start. Just watching it on social media. So surveillance has taken so many, is intelligence, right? And human intelligence is better. They're more they're making far better use of drones on the battlefield. And the last one I'm going to talk about, okay? Reconnaissance is different than surveillance, because reconnaissance is when you're willing to go put yourself out there and fight for information. And I used to do this. This was my job in the U.S. Army. I had cavalry troop of 140 soldiers, and we'd send them out in small teams, and their job was to go out and sit there for 2 or 3 days, hide, observe, and pass back information, okay? And we used to do this with sniper teams in Iraq, and we'd send them out, and most of the time they'd never shoot at any, take notes, and to report where these ammunition dumps are, where these generals are, okay? And these fearless people who are civilians, who are volunteering, special forces teams who are going behind enemy lines, they are the ones making, these American HIMARS are not winning the war, okay? They're just a delivery system of, they're very good, but